Coming up on this week's show, more Intellivision Amico drama.
A new, faster way to play PS2 games.
And we go inside the world of competitive gaming with Capcom and Tengen's Chris Tang.
The Retro Hour podcast is brought to you each and every week with our good friends at Bitmap Books. Now, you need to check out their latest book, Go Straight, The Ultimate Guide to Side-Scrolling Beat-em-Ups. Get ready for the fight of your life and taking you behind the scenes on legendary games like Double Dragon, Golden Axe, Final Fight, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and some more obscure brawlers that you need to try as well. Pre-orders are available right now for shipping on February 25th. You can find out more and the rest of their retro gaming books at bitmapbooks.co.uk. Hello and welcome to the Retro Hour podcast, episode number 314, your weekly dose of retro gaming and technology news with me, Dan Wood.
Me, Ravi Abbott.
And me, Joe Fox.
And a very warm welcome to the podcast that every week takes you behind the scenes of classic video games, reminiscing about those golden video games consoles, you know, the 8-bit, the 16-bit, the early 32-bit systems, even 64-bit. Yeah, I know 64-bit sounds quite modern, but Atari were doing that with the Jaguar back in 1993.
Do the math, Dan. Do the math.
Let's not get into that debate right now. But that's what we do. I mean, we reminisce about, you know, the systems that we played growing up, the companies as well. We get the developers on, the guys that used to run the companies, all sorts, everything to do with vintage video games. And actually, this week, we're going to be going behind the scenes of competitive gaming. Now, obviously, at the moment, esports is a huge deal. I think probably even more so since the pandemic. But competitive gaming has been a thing since the earliest days of video games.
We knew they were doing it back in the days with Pac-Man and stuff like that, but we're going to be going into the 90s with this one and talking to an absolutely amazing guest who worked with Capcom and Tengen as well, which are companies that we've not really covered before, but I tell you, Joe is in his absolute element in this interview.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we spoke to Chris Tang, who has just had an absolutely amazing career. And as you say, he started off kind of like in the early days of esports. You know, he was out there winning all these big competitions when he was like 12, 13 years old. And then he actually ended up landing a job with Tengen and Atari and then ended up working at Capcom. So as Ravi says, I was in my element because we finally kind of got somebody who had their foot in the door with not just Capcom, but with Capcom of Japan. And, you know, he worked on some massive games like Marvel vs. Capcom, Street Fighter Third Strike, you know, and he also worked on like some of the smaller games like Gauntlet 4. And we also kind of got like his side of the story on Primal Rage 2, because he actually worked on Primal Rage and then went into Primal Rage 2, which, you know, that's a huge story that, you know, never came out. And it was just really awesome just to kind of hear his side of things. And, you know, it was quite a sad story, but it kind of came full circle and it was quite nice in the end. So definitely one of my favourite interviews we've ever done. I absolutely loved it and just was in my element talking about fighting games for like an hour.
It's great because he offers a unique perspective because he comes from Hawaii. So he's kind of positioned between Japan and America. And he was also in this insane gaming competition that was actually held by Sega on Alcatraz. So yeah, actually played that, and he was in the Nintendo World Championship, so he had one of those World Championship carts as well.
Yeah, awesome.
You know
story.
what? Whenever I see like footage from video game competitions back then, obviously Nintendo World Championships was a big one, but I mean we had, you know, Walter Day on here from Twin Galaxies, you know, obviously this King of Con stuff like that, and it blows me away the skills that those players had back then. I mean, this is before the days where you could jump on YouTube and watch a speed run and copy it.
Yeah, and, you know, this one, the Alcatraz, the Rock on the Rock, was actually, you know, broadcast on MTV as well. So it wasn't on your Twitch or any kind of online streaming services like that. You know, it was direct to your TV, and it shows how big it was. You know, I think Sega gave away £25,000 and he won that.
Don't you wish you were good enough at gaming to take part in competition?
I would never win that.
Just to win like 25 grand just from being amazing at Sonic.
They'd probably take money away from me.
You know, we've been to like, you know, Play Expo and that kind of thing before. I think you've actually taken part in a couple of competitions, haven't you, Joe? I've seen you up there.
Yeah, I randomly entered a Dragon Ball Z Fighters competition, you know, and I love Dragon Ball Z, but I never played this game. And it was like the week it came out on PS4. and I came like 8th. It was like insane. Like
out of 8 people, yeah?
Yeah, out of 8 people. No, it was out of like a good like couple of hundred people. Like, you know, me and our friend Alex, who's a friend of the show, entered. And you had to pay to enter. And we thought, oh, this would be really funny. And I felt really bad because Alex got knocked out in the first round. And then I won like my first 3 rounds. And the top prize was like 500 quid and a PS4. And I was like, started to think like, oh man, what if I actually win this? You know, like if I actually win like 500 quid, that'd be amazing. But then I got absolutely battered. Like the 4th round, didn't even land a hit on like the guy I played. But yeah, man, like that for me was amazing. And that was just like a couple of hundred people. So it was so cool kind of hearing, you know, Chris's point of view of, like you say, he was on the Rock at Alcatraz and at, you know, the Nintendo World Championship in 1990. So really, really fun stories.
Yeah, and it's going to be great to hear some kind of background on, you know, these events are now legendary, aren't they? They've gone down in like gaming lore now. So Chris Tang, our special guest, Joe and Ravi are going to be catching up with him on the show in around 25 minutes from now. Now, we bring you a guest on the show every week, but also we bring you up to date on everything that's been happening in the world of retro gaming and technology. Some big stories to get into in just a moment. But, you know, we don't want to give it the hard sell at the start of the show, but I just want to quickly remind you that the reason we can bring you this podcast every week is thanks to our incredible supporters on Patreon. I was actually chatting to someone on Discord the other day, and they were telling me that they listen to the podcast every week, and they were like, I thought I should get involved in this Patreon thing, but I don't really know what it is, if I'm honest. And it kind of struck me that maybe we've not really explained this well enough for a lot of people. What is Patreon then, Ravi?
It's patronage, basically supporting the arts. You know, it's been around forever, but they've actually created a platform for it. And the way that it works is, you know, you can pay a small fee and you're actually helping support the podcast, keeping it going, and you get an ad-free episode of the podcast. You get a special RSS stream as well, where you can have after-hours episodes, which we do, extended interviews, and you know, lots more stuff. Like we have a meetup with all our patrons where we actually meet up and video chat. So you're basically helping support the podcast, but you're also getting a load of bonus benefits from doing that.
Yeah, and I think we've been kind of hovering around 260 patrons for about 3 or 4 months now. It kind of just keeps going over, then drops under again, which, you know, is the way these things go. I mean, you know, obviously things come up and people kind of, you know, afford to keep paying. We completely understand that. Then new people come in. I think at the time of recording this, we're on 262 now, which is incredible. But obviously anything we get into Patreon, it really helps us out with the running of the show as well, and just make sure that we can bring it out each and every Friday for you. And like Ravi said, you get the perks, you get it ad-free, you get the normal podcast early most weeks, you get the exclusive patrons only podcast, the After Hours show. This week, actually, an special extended episode, another hour with Ian Grieve from Signosis, which is, you know, so many people have been asking for that. So that's out now as an After Hours episode. And also we're going to be doing our Patrons Hangout, that we do a big video chat. Everyone gets together and geeks out on the last Sunday of the month. That'll be coming up on the 27th of February. So if you want to get invited to that, and of course have the satisfaction of knowing that you support this show and ensure that it comes out each and every week, you can join us on Patreon at theretrohour.com. All the details are on there. And I want to say a big thank you to the 3 new patrons that have signed up this week. A huge thank you to Niklas Lundberg Lisemark,
Luke Ireland,
and Tony Boes,
who all join us on Patreon this week. We hugely appreciate your support. And if you'd like to do the same, you'll find it at theretrohour.com. Now, one story that we need to talk about this week is something that we first mentioned on this podcast. I think it must be around 3 or 4 years ago, that to say it's kind of been filled with many twists and turns and drama over the last 4 years would be understating it slightly. But this is the Intellivision Amico. Now, this is a system, just to kind of recap it, it was Tommy Tallarico was really the main guy behind this. And it was kind of a project to kind of bring back the couch gaming era of video game systems. Obviously, Intellivision was a big name in the earliest days of consoles. And they've been saying that what they want to do is get kids off Xbox Live and get them off playing the Switch online, get them to sit down with the family and bring back couch gaming. That was the aim of it. But now, in 2022, 2 years after this system was first promised to be launched back in 2020, there is still no sign of it. And there have been some, I've got to say, now, if I was a backer of this project, maybe some quite worrying updates that have come out over the last couple of weeks, and including this article that I'll link up in Nintendo Live that now claims the Intellivision Amico may never see the light of day.
Yeah, we've kind of decided not to cover it massively on this podcast because it was just kind of, as I said, drama and a little bit back and forth. But this seems to be really kind of significant news. It looks like a good fun system for Intellivision fans and co-op people. And also Tommy Tallarico is a real legend in the video game world. He's created a lot of music and a lot of fantastic games, but it seems like he's now stepped down and been replaced as the CEO. And he was very much the kind of evangelical head of the Amico Intellivision, and he was kind of really pushing it and doing lots of interviews out there about it. So it seems kind of a bit bad. What's going on?
Well, the latest thing is, like you said, Tommy, in the last month, has been replaced as CEO by a guy called Phil Adam, who was a revenue officer before. Now, I've got to say, I was looking at Tommy's Twitter feed before, and it turns out his father is seriously ill at the moment. So that could be a big reason as to why, he doesn't want to be doing the day-to-day running. And, obviously our best wishes with Tommy and his family. But also there's been one thing that you've got to do is, this kind of companies have done an SEC filing. Now, this is where they kind of, obviously anyone that wants to open themselves up for investment, they've got to kind of outlay the risks and everything of investing
Security
in a firm like Intellivision.
Exchange Commission, is it? That's
Yes, which is an American body, I believe. I'm not too up on investment, but there are some points that actually, if you read this article on Nintendo Life, they've pulled out a few of the headlines from this filing where, they've got to be transparent because obviously if you're asking for investment, you've got to lay the risks down. You've got to be honest about everything. But one thing they've put out there that seems to be the headline of this is, it is possible there may never be a fully operational Intellivision Amico, and it's possible that the failure to release the product is a result of a change in business model upon the company making a determination of that business model or some other factor which will not be in the best interest of the company and its stockholders or creditors. So it turns out actually that, since it started this company back in 2018, they haven't actually generated any profit. And in fact, they reckon that there is $3.1 million in outstanding loans. So there's quite, heavy debts there as well. And they've also raised around $17 million, all these investment drives that they've been doing to design this console and market it as well, and paying for the development of software for it too. And now they're actually looking for yet more investment. And there is another crowdfunder running at the moment on a website called Start Engine, which is an investment site where they're aiming to get another $5 million. From memory, I believe this is their fifth investment round. And at the time of recording, they've only raised $58,000 on there. So, quite a long way off the 5 million mark. But it kind of doesn't look, I'm not an investor, like I said, but the fact this has been delayed 3 times now, we know the world's been difficult over the last couple of years, with chip shortages and that kind of thing, but it doesn't look that promising, I've got to say.
To be honest, coming from a background of Amiga computer and other systems, you do kind of see a lot of this hype, and I hate to use the word vaporware, but if it doesn't appear, then it is vaporware, and like it's really tough. You can live off hype for a certain amount of time, but if you're not making profit for that long, and you're not kind of diversifying, I would think even if they were just to offer like branding or something else, if they couldn't have done that, I think it's a bit of a tough situation to be asking for the money again. And I don't know if they've kind of got enough support, especially with Tommy not on board now. It's a tough situation for the Intellivision fans out there.
Yeah, because they did show some of the hardware at a gaming show in America last summer. And if you look on YouTube, there are actually a few videos of people actually playing some of the early games on there. So the hardware does look like it's, in some form actually out there. But then, like you said, they're asking for another $5 million to kind of get this thing over the line. And if you look at the little trailer they've put on here, it's pretty much identical to the one that they put out back in 2018. So, and even the game clips in there are the same ones that they put out 2 or 3 years ago. So from looking at this, if you saw the original one, it doesn't look like it's come on all that far in the last few years. And let me play you a little bit of the trailer because it gives you more of their idea for what they want this system to be.
Intellivision is bringing families back together again with an innovative gaming console called Amico. 40 years ago, video games burst onto the scene as families connected gaming consoles to their television sets and enjoyed playing simple games together. It didn't take long for video games to grow into a multi-billion-dollar industry as the digital play from companies such as Atari, Coleco, and Intellivision became an integral part of childhood culture. But by the mid-90s, the video game industry took a turn. Easy-to-play games became sophisticated, controllers became complicated, and consoles became expensive. Sadly, family play was replaced by solo play, and rooms full of laughter were replaced by insulating headsets. But all of that is about to change with the arrival of Amico.
First thing I thought when I heard that is they're basically saying that gaming has just been for hardcore gamers since the mid-90s.
Yeah.
Completely forgetting stuff like the Wii.
Yeah,
which was like
think that's
the ultimate party console.
They're forgetting casual gaming, and I've always think that's been the bit of the problem with it. I've never been able to kind of see the business model there. But it's interesting to kind of see what they're doing. But even saying stuff like it's going to be cheaper, I've heard reports that they're going to actually have to increase the price of the unit now to make any profit at all if it does actually get this investment and if it does come out.
Well, they're looking, someone's kind of gone through all the figures here as well, and there's a couple of comments on Nintendo Live. Someone's worked out that they're going to have to sell them for $200 to kind of break even.
Yeah.
Now, which, you know, you're kind of getting into like kind of Switch category there, which I think, I mean, I agree with you. I've never seen the business model here. And we said the same thing about the Atari VCS console before it came out. And, you know, don't want to say I was right, but I think we probably
Well, I predicted that the Switch would be a failure, so don't listen to me.
Yeah, don't listen to Ravi.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, it looks like, you know, based on the money they've got right now, if they don't get this this $5 million, which will apparently keep them going for the next 7 to 9 months, if they only raise $10,000, they'll only have operating cash for another month, apparently. So I've got to say, it's not looking very positive for them, is it? But maybe it's for the best, because again, like with the Atari VCS, if this thing does come out, I'm just not convinced it's going to have a market. And you think, you know, guys like Tommy and that have got a long experience of the video game sector would probably be a bit more clued up on that. But yeah, I just can't see it personally. So we'll keep an eye on it, though. It may surprise us. If you want to read all about the Intellivision Amico drama so far, I'll link up those articles and the current crowdfunder in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, PlayStation 2, obviously the biggest selling console in history. I think we've all got a PS2 somewhere in the cupboard, if not set up. I actually set my PS2 up again the other day as a DVD player. In my office, actually, I've got to say. But one of my PlayStation 2s, I've got a fat PS2 that's got the the free boot mod on there. I've got a hard disk in the back, loads of games loaded on it too. But the problem always was that if you've got one of the slim model PlayStation 2s, obviously it was harder to hook up a hard disk and everything. And really the main way that people could play, modded games, if you like, your backups, was using the very slow USB port on there. But actually there is a new solution, and there's a really cool video on here by Macho Nacho Productions. Play PlayStation 2 games from a memory card. Now this uses a new device called the MC2 SIO MX4SIO. So this is a little device that you plug into the memory card slot on a PlayStation 2, and then it's got a little SD card adapter that you pop in, and you can actually load games and play them from the memory card slot, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, that's absolutely awesome, because it's like when I was growing up, my friend Richard modded his PS2, but it was the fat PS2, and he had the hard drive in the back. And he did it all so we could play modded versions of Guitar Hero 2. But it could also emulate, snares, and we could emulate PlayStation 2 games on it. But like you say, the slim model could never do that. And, the option would be to plug the hard drive into the USB port. But it caused issues of like flickering on the FMVs, and you'd have like major game slowdown. And it was all because of the USB port was it a USB 1.1? So it's
very slow.
A very slow one. So does this essentially upgrade the USB port? Is that essentially what's happening? It's making it so it works better?
No, this completely bypasses.
Oh, because it's through the memory card
you don't
slot.
use it at all, which amazes me. Yeah, because I didn't know that actually the memory card slot was faster than USB.
Yeah, that's
wow.
That's really
so
surprising.
I thought it was going to be the memory card slot and the USB, but it is just the memory card slot essentially. Yeah, that's insane.
And does it play games at like a decent rate? Because I remember I had one of these SD card adapters for the Dreamcast that would go via the serial port at the back, and there'd be a few glitches and like music wouldn't work and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, from what I've seen so far, I mean, this isn't actually out yet. So it comes out today, February 18th, Friday, February 18th, the day the show comes out. There's a small initial batch coming out, but obviously there's this video that's around 20 minutes long, kind of demonstrating that as well. But they're saying actually from what I've seen of this video, the games seem to run quite well. Like you said, I mean, a lot better, Joe, than running off the USB ports. Yeah. I don't imagine it's probably not quite up to speed of having a dedicated IDE hard disk in the fat model. But, considering this is running via a card slot that was just meant to load and save game data, apparently it's it's a lot quicker than the USB ports on there. So the games that they're showing actually look pretty good. Now, there is a Google Doc that they've got here with a list of compatible games. It kind of details how well each game runs. They've either shaded them green, which means they're fully compatible. There's some that are amber that may have some issues, maybe glitching FMVs and that kind of thing. Some are red that just don't run at all. So compatibility is not 100%. But looking through this list already, bearing in mind this is a pre-launch list, I'd say there is probably around maybe 70% of games seem to run pretty much flawlessly on here.
This is awesome, and you're doing no modification on your machine physically. Yeah, it's all soft mod, and I love to mod my machines and, hack around with them, but I'm such a noob when it comes to PlayStation. I remember my mate getting one of the fat ones and showing me that there was a hard drive in the back. I was like, what? There's a hard drive in a PlayStation?
I didn't know for years that there was that big empty slot on the back of the big fat PlayStations, and it wasn't until, like I say, that we started modding Guitar Hero and stuff like that it was like 2006, 2007. It was just like, oh, the back comes off and there's a big gap here for a hard drive.
Is it for storing biscuits?
Yeah, is this for my cookies? But apparently it was literally, it never came out in the UK and America, the official PlayStation hard drive, because it was so easy to just put ROMs on there.
Yeah, because we had because you needed the network adapter, didn't you?
Yeah,
and we had one of those in our PlayStation 2. There's an Ethernet port on the back, but we never got it working.
Yeah,
and then my brother gave me his LPS2 probably around like 12, 13 years ago. I tried to put a hard disk in it then, but it wasn't working. So it turned out the one that we got with our PS2 back in like 2000, 2001, turned out never worked at all, but I got like a third-party one off eBay and that worked fine. But you're right. I mean, I don't remember anyone really using that when the PlayStation 2 was in its prime. It really just seems to be, and probably the reason that they took it off the later models is because it was really just used as a piracy device by most people. But this, I mean, the thing about it is as well, you've got to remember these systems are getting on for like, 21 years old now, 22 years old actually. And I know that a lot of the lasers on the original PlayStation 2s are getting a bit flaky now. The older they get, that is probably the main part of the system that's going to fail.
Yeah,
so having a device like this where, you don't have to use your original DVDs and, you don't have to wear out your lasers, having something that's pretty much a plug-and-play solution, playing your PS2 library from an SD card through the memory card slot. And it's very tidy. I mean, this is only the size of a memory card as well. It's not a messy solution.
Yeah, I think, from remembering back in the day, there was all wires and, like you say, you had to have that network adapter in there. And, I think, I'm not too sure if you had to have an online connection on there. I don't think you did. But this, like you say, it's such a nice, neat solution. And the fact that it works with the PlayStation 2 Slim is even neater. It's just all very smooth, which is awesome.
It's cheap as well. Like, you look at EverDrives and stuff, and they're quite expensive. This is like $20, and obviously it's sold out instantly. It's going to be a while till you can get these, but $20 is a real decent price for that.
Yeah, I've got a feeling anyone that's a PlayStation 2 gamer in 2022 is probably going to have their hands in one of these before the end of the year, fingers crossed. It's going to be an essential purchase, I think. So if you want to read more about that, I'll link that video up in our show notes as well. Now, did you know that you could make video calls on your Game Boy Advance? You could have done this back in 2004, Joe.
There's so much stuff coming out for the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance. So it's not even coming out. It's so much stuff that
it's been discovered.
Came out and is being discovered, and they're such random little gadgets which came out, in the 90s and 2000s, and I absolutely love it. And I love that this video from our friend, the Retro Future, who we've had on before, has discovered in the deepest, darkest part of the internet, this Japanese exclusive, the Campo Advance, I believe it is called.
Yeah, it's really awesome. Just to say as well, the Retro Future's just had his motorbike wrecked and destroyed. So if you guys can help support him, check that out as well, because he's a really good guy. This is quite mad. It actually works on 3G.
Okay.
Did any of you guys have a 3G video calling device? I actually had one. It was like one of these early LG phones.
I don't recall, no.
Like I had obviously Nokia phones that had 3G on, but I don't remember ever doing video calls on them.
Well, I had one, and another person in the city had one, and we were the only two people that could call each other. And it was just like we'd call each other and go, look, I'm chatting to someone on video. And it was like really low quality. But just the novelty of being able to do a video call was absolutely amazing. And it's quite old technology, actually, 3G. And Elliot does a call on this. And the quality of it is all right, especially for the Game Boy Advance.
I mean, it's 1.1 megapixel camera and it's 5 frames per second performance. So, it's definitely better than the original Game Boy camera. I'll give it that. But yeah, it's for 2004, like you say, it's better than what you would expect. But essentially, this is a device that plugs into your Game Boy SP that did come out. It was an actual commercial, piece of technology that came out in Japan, and they produced 10,000 units of it. But from what I understand, like you say, you have to plug it into your Game Boy Advance, and then you also have to plug it into a phone with 3G on it as well, and then you have to plug it into anything else. I feel like there's
and a power supply.
Supply, that was it. Yeah,
using the SIM card of the phone.
Essentially
to connect to the network.
But it isn't very portable if you're having to plug it into a power supply as well.
No,
so you've got it into your phone, which, like you say, Ravi, is probably using the SIM card. And then you've got it into your Game Boy Advance, and then it's plugged into a power supply. Also, you can make a video call in 2004. And it cost 19,000 yen, which was around about £164 or $220 back in 2004. So, not the cheapest product. And like you say, Ravi, it was probably to call one other person who had it in the city.
Yeah, but also, you would have to plug it in, because that is going to be a battery rinser. There'd be no way that could run off battery. Totally not.
You see, video calling's got a kind of a difficult history, really. I remember seeing my first video phone, and I've just Googled this now. It was a thing called the Relate 2000, the British Telecom made back in around 1992, 93. And I remember going into the BT shop when British Telecom actually used to have shops with my dad and my brother, and they actually had two of these set up.
Oh, wow.
In the shop at different ends of it, and you could video call each other. And again, it was colour from memory. Again, it was probably really slow, I think about 3 frames a second, and came out of either a little teeny speaker on there. You had to hold the handset up. I remember thinking that was pretty cool, but I remember thinking, even then, do I really want to see all my friends every time I call them? Because I don't know about you guys. I use video calling now on stuff like Teams and Zoom and that, for work.
Yeah, that's it. Literally work. Like when I saw it in Star Trek, I was like, right, I'm going to use this all the time. This is the future. But only during the pandemic, when you couldn't see people, I was using it for social reasons and pub quizzes and stuff like that. But now literally the only video call and stuff that I do is just for work. Just meet someone, see them, and it's kind of got this formality about it, hasn't it? Video calling.
Well, you have to brush your hair and
get dressed,
shave,
So I think video calling's always been something that we think we want. I don't know, because I see if I'm out and about, often kind of at the risk of sounding like a real old fart, the younger generation,
the youth,
I often see teenagers and stuff on FaceTime and that walking around, trying not to bang into lampposts and that kind of thing. So maybe it's something that kids do more these days. I don't know, but it's in terms of video calls, it's just not really something that I feel has kind of taken off as much as they all said it would, back in the 90s and 2000s, that, no one would make audio calls anymore and everything would be video chat.
Maybe we're the generation that need to wear a suit and sit there and look prim and proper, and everyone else just doesn't care.
In front of your Game Boy Advance.
Yeah. Next time I have a Teams meeting at work, I'm calling you from my Game Boy Advance, guys. Bear with me.
So yeah, it is a cool little device. I always love seeing kind of fail tech as well and stuff that, could have changed the world if it took off back then. So that's a really cool video that Elliot's made. And you'll find that in our show notes as well. Now, plenty more stories to talk about, including we're going to be talking about an MS-DOS game that was made in QBasic that I used to play at school, actually, and Ravi's found a great little article about that. And the coolest Apple Watch retro stand you've ever seen. More about that in a moment. But before we do, let's take a second to give a big thank you to one of our incredible supporters. And this is our friends at Future Publishing, who are, of course, behind the incredible Retro Gamer magazine. Now, of course, if you listen to our podcast each week, you need to be reading Retro Gamer, the magazine that comes out every month, and all the stuff we talk about, they give you all that and lots more as well. And not only do Future Publishing talk about the classic gaming as well, but also they focus on the current generation of consoles and PC gaming as well, with a range of gaming magazines that they've got, including the published PC Gamer magazine.
Yeah, I love PC Gamer, and I also love Edge as well, because that's super cool. But PC Gamer at the moment, they're covering Homeworld 3. That was a classic title, Homeworld, and also the new Steam Deck, which seems to be coming out, and Edge are covering Somerville, which looks like a really awesome indie game coming out.
Yeah, and also they do Play magazine as well. If you're a PlayStation fan, I know you're pretty hyped for Final Fantasy Origin. There's the cover feature about that this month.
Yeah, they've got Final Fantasy Origin on the front of Play magazine there, and they're also going to be covering the PlayStation VR 2, which there's a lot of hype about at the moment. So not just retro stuff, which is really cool.
But of course, they do Retro Gamer magazine. The current issue that you'll find in the shop's got Pilot Wings on the front cover. I've actually got the next issue that comes out, all about Earthworm Jim as well. Obviously, one of the best platformer games back in the day. Always loved Earthworm Jim. I mean, it's just a character with so much attitude. It was like playing a cartoon character, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah, 100%.
So we go really in depth into the backstory. Dave Perry, Nick Brucey, Tommy Tallarico talking about Earthworm Jim's evolution over the last few decades. There's actually a 6-page feature in here as well with AVGN, James Rolfe, kind of going behind the scenes on probably the most famous YouTube gaming series out there. Attack of the Mutant Camels. There's something here about the network adapter. We're talking about PlayStation 2 games. I've actually got a feature on playing PS2 games with the network adapter online. The making of Crash Bandicoot and Spyro. Looking at the PlayStation 3, which I guess is now considered retro. The Ultimate Guide to Pinball Dreams. The making of Darkseid as well. So you'll find all that kind of stuff every month in Retro Gamer magazine. And we want you to try out some of Future Publishing's incredible gaming magazines for yourself. And of course, by taking up this amazing offer, you'll be really helping out the podcast as well. And I will say, take advantage of this offer now, because it only comes up a couple of times a year, and we get so many tweets after the fact, people going, I missed out, is it still on? So you can get 3 issues for just £1 of your favourite Future Publishing gaming magazine with our exclusive offer, which is just for Retro Hour listeners. All you got to do is head to our link, magazinesdirect.com/retro hour. So that's magazinesdirect.com/retro hour. And I've worked this out. That's a saving of around 95%.
Insane.
On the cover price, isn't it? For just £1, 3 issues of Retro Gamer, Edge Play, or PC Gamer UK, magazinesdirect.com/retro hour. And of course, a big thank you to our friends at Future Publishing for their continued support of our show. Now, you and I are both rocking the Apple Watch, Ravi. We get constantly nagged throughout the day. Every time a message comes in and, you don't look at it on your phone, there it is on your wrist. Little reminder that you need to stand up. You haven't done that for around 45 minutes. Sometimes it tells me to breathe.
It tells me to wash my hands, and it tells me how long I should do it. Yeah.
And it sounds like you guys have got your bloody mums on your wrists there.
It does feel like that. But, actually, sometimes you get a bit of a break from it, so you can take it off at night. But you need something nice to put it on your bedside table. And at the moment, because the Apple Watch comes with this little kind of flimsy magnet that you just kind of clip onto the back of it, and often it doesn't really hold.
And it doesn't look very nice on your table,
no.
And it just slides around, and you just chuck it on there. Yeah.
Well, Ravi's been looking for kind of retro-inspired Apple Watch stands, and he found one that is actually a classic Macintosh.
Yeah, well, there's this company called Elego, and they seem to be making these like little rubber kind of stands that look absolutely wicked. They've done a classic Mac, which is one that I absolutely love, and you put the charger in the back, and then the Apple Watch screen is displayed on the classic Mac. But they've also got a whole range of them. So they've got like Game Boy ones as well, and this isn't sponsored or anything. I just love this company. They've got like TV case as well for your Apple TV, which is a SNES, and like they've got the iWatch, the iMac. They've got one like that as well, and I think the price range is really good on these. So it's like $14.
Oh wow!
At the moment, so this is really cheap, like little nice classy kind of thing that you can have at the side, and I'm definitely going to get one. I kind of like having the classic Mac there as well, because it's a bit like the Mac legacy. You've got your Apple Watch and then you've got your old school like little Mac there, and it's just a dock that fits the charger in, and it just looks so well done. What do you think, guys?
I think it looks cool because I'm looking at the Game Boy one, and you're right, the actual screen of the Apple Watch goes where the screen of the Game Boy would be. So you see your Apple Watch's screen through that kind of cutout for it, which I think is quite nice. Again, I mean, it's just a bit of rubber.
Yeah, just a little bit of silicone, really, yeah.
Yeah. But I do like the look of it, and you're right, because I mean, that is kind of one thing that... So I remember, when the original iPhone came out and stuff, you remember you used to get like a dock with it, and you did the original iPods and stuff as well. Then gradually, I mean, I've got like an iPhone 13 now. You don't even get a charger in the box anymore.
No.
You just get like a USB cable, and it's like, they don't give you all this stuff. And trying to connect all your devices at night when you go to bed and having them laid out all over the table, it does get a bit messy.
And Apple stuff is expensive. Like, you're not going to be able to get anything for $15 that's going to like look decent or, kind of help with it. But these are fantastic. We'll leave a link in the show notes, and I'm going to get one of these, and I just think they're really nice. And check out this company, Elago.
Yeah, and any way to sneak a bit of retro into the bedroom, I think it's quite cool, isn't it? Now, before we get into our chat this week, talking all about the history of competitive gaming with Chris Tang, he's coming up in a second. This is a cool little article you found, Ravi, on howtogeek.com. This is by Benj Edwards, who does some great articles. He's a podcaster in America as well. There's a lot of retro gaming and retro technology podcasts too. This is all about a game that I used to play at school, and actually, I'd forgotten about this. Now, this was a game that was included with MS-DOS in QBasic, a game called Gorilla.
You see, I never knew about this one. Like, this looks blooming awesome. It was actually like a hidden game, and we love these like secret games in there. So what was it, Dan? QBasic is a programming language, right?
Yeah, so this was in MS-DOS. So I remember, I think we first started getting Windows PCs probably around 92, 93 at school. I mean, we're still mainly Acorn Archimedes then, but we had a few like Windows 3.1 machines, including one in the library that I used to play with sometimes. And QBasic was on there. And the only way you could access this game is because it was written in QBasic. So it was actually one of the included demos that you get in there. So you couldn't just run it directly from DOS. You had to load QBasic and then load up Gorilla.bas, it was called. But me and my friend Ricky, we used to play this so often, during like wet lunch breaks or whatever, we go in the library and play with this. Really what it is, it's kind of a bit like a primitive version of something like Scorched Earth or Worms.
Okay.
So you get two gorillas who stand on the top of a skyscraper, and from memory, I think they're kind of randomly generated different heights of skyscrapers, and then you get exploding bananas, and you've got to kind of set the angle and throw them at each other to try and blow each other up.
It looks pretty dope, actually. I really need to play this, and they're saying that there's a new version of it. Well, there's a version of it now that you can actually play online on archive.org. And, I'm glad that this has brought back some nostalgia for you.
Can't you play everything on archive.org?
Yeah, man. Absolutely. I must say, your wet lunch breaks looked a lot more entertaining than mine at school. We just used to get given the cubes that like attached to each other, like the little plastic cubes that you did like with maths, and we just got to play with them. Like
that sounds depressing.
Yeah, it's pretty depressing when you look back, whereas you were playing a primitive version of Worms, throwing banana bombs at each other. But
you see, back in the 90s when the teachers didn't know what you were doing, the screen was faced away. They thought we were looking up library books or something on there.
Maybe.
There's a lot of hidden games. Like, I remember there was one in Excel and stuff like that, and there was like flight simulators and stuff, but it was all about like knowing the commands. So like, obviously you guys would be in the knowledge, but there'd be other people playing other weird stuff. I remember the first time I went up and I loaded up that flight simulator that was in, I think it was in Excel. People were just like, what? I can play a game on Excel? Okay. It would be like, right, abandon all kind of office or spreadsheet stuff that I was doing and just play this all day.
You're right, because there was this game Yeah, the Gorilla game on there. And there's another one in QBasic called Nibbles, which is actually in this article a bit further down. It was kind of like a snake clone.
Oh, nice.
And we used to play those a lot. And I remember a few other kids would see them and they'd be like, load that up, game up for it, because no one knew how to load it up. To go via QBasic, and I was the only one that figured it out. But then in our main computer classes, when we had the Acorn Archimedes, we played Lander. Obviously, the David Braben game, Virus, it was launched as, I think, that was included on the demo disc on the Acorn Archimedes. We'd often play that in class when, like, the teacher wasn't looking. And then I remember someone found, I think it might have been like a shareware version of Doom that someone had put on the network. And I remember kind of playing that and getting told off.
The one I used to...
Certain times people would sneak in discs or whatever. It was always cool.
The one I used to load up was, it was a Star Wars that was done in ASCII. And I think you'd load it up on Telnet, and then people would sit there watching an ASCII version of Star Wars, like, oh my God, this is amazing.
But I mean, obviously, you can just play these games so easily now, so you don't have to go, hacking into BASIC on MS-DOS 5 to play Gorillas now. You can do it straight in your web browser. So if you want to check that out again, very nostalgic looking back. I'll put that and all of our stories, you'll find them all in our show notes at theretrohour.com. Now, Chris Tang is coming up in just a second. Let's quickly give a thank you to another big sponsor of the Retro Hour podcast, and this is our friends at ExpressVPN. Now, we've talked before, Ravi, about how important it is, and increasingly so all the time, to have a VPN to protect your online privacy. But the most important thing we think is actually having a VPN that you trust as well, because there are so many out there, and often free ones that actually sell you data. That's the reason that they're free. And obviously, we do research on our sponsors as well, and we only recommend brands that we really trust. And you've been a user even before ExpressVPN were a sponsor of this podcast. You've always rated them as the best VPN on the market.
Oh yeah, the ExpressVPN is just so fast. The streaming quality is like amazing. I forget that it's on quite a lot of the time. I've got it so it automatically starts on my computer, but you can have it set up on your phone so you can do that, and I really trust it as well. It's really fantastic. Like, it's so lightweight. When I've actually loaded up the applications and stuff, that sometimes I've had other ones slow down and there's been a bit of lag and stuff, but this is just like absolutely fantastic, blazing fast.
Well, they've got a technology called their trusted server that makes their VPN servers pretty much incapable of storing any data at all. So they're not storing stuff, they're not tracking you or anything like that. And they've also got something called Lightway as well, which is a new VPN protocol they've engineered to make user speeds faster than ever before. Because you're right, I mean, I've used some of the free VPNs before, and you have it on in the background, you try and watch a YouTube video, and you get the spinning wheel and
stuttering
it doesn't play. Yeah, all the time. With ExpressVPN, stream videos in HD, no buffering, anything like that. So that's the thing that really sets it apart, and how easy it is to use as well. You don't need any technical skills to set it up. Open the app, tap a button, you're connected. Even your grandparents could do this as well. And it's not just us saying that. Business Insider, The Verge, many of the tech journals rate ExpressVPN as the #1 VPN in the world. So you can protect yourself with the VPN that we use and trust by using our exclusive link, and of course help out the podcast by showing some love to our sponsors, expressvpn.com/retro. Use that today and you will get 3 months free on a 1-year package. That's an extra 3 months completely free of ExpressVPN by using our link expressvpn.com/retro. And a big thank you to our mates at ExpressVPN for their continued support of our show. Right then, next, time to get some inside stories about classic competitive gaming, going behind the scenes on companies like Capcom and Tengen as well, with our special guest, Chris Tang, is next on the Retro Hour podcast.
You're listening to the Retro Hour podcast, and I'm here today with Chris Tang. How are you doing, Chris?
I'm doing great. After getting my computer up and running, I'm just all ready to be interviewed by you guys.
Awesome. Well, we've got a question that we always ask our guests, and that was, what was your first video gaming experience or memory?
I was really small, probably just a few years old, and it's probably Pac-Man. I probably saw it at some kind of public place. I remember, especially, I grew up in Hawaii, and we had department stores, and we had other, like a drugstore. I think a block away from where I lived, there was a Long's Drugs. I think the chain is not in business anymore, but it's been taken over by CVS or Rite Aid or one of those companies. But in Hawaii, it's still called Long's Drugs because over there, they still kind of respect when a brand's been around long enough, they keep the local names there. So it's still called Long's Drugs in Hawaii, but they always had two arcade machines back to back by the checkout counters. So every time my mom would take me to the store, I would see these arcade games and I'd walk up to it and I would just be mesmerized by the lights. So I'm pretty sure it was like Pac-Man or one of those early 80s games that I first saw. And, I would eventually get like a quarter, pop it in, and I wouldn't be very good at it. But I had a lot of fun playing arcade games, and arcade games just really entranced me when I was little. And I would play those games. And then eventually, consoles would come out. I think my cousins had like a 2600. They were kind of mean to me. They didn't let me play very much. So I ended up eventually I got like a ColecoVision that my dad got me when I was still very little, and that was my first console.
Was Hawaii then? What was it? A bit kind of behind with the releases in the States, and did you have any gaming stores?
Not. It was really ahead of the curve. It is halfway between Japan and the US. So I would see Japanese arcade games like everywhere, and the kids at school that I hung out with, they were all getting stuff from their relatives in Asia. Like they'd have relatives in like Hong Kong or Japan, and I would go to their house, and that's where I saw a Famicom for the first time. And this is how I found out about import gaming, and there were games that I had no idea either existed, such as Gradius 2 and Super Mario Brothers 3. I had those games months and months before they were released in the US. And I even found out that some of them were different. Like I found out later on when they eventually did bring out Super Mario 3 to the Western world, they dumbed it down, and I was offended. I'm like, what do they think we are? Do they think we're bad at games and that Mario has to take an extra hit because we suck or something? I was offended. I was like, well, what's up with this? And but import gaming was like this huge new world of games to me, and I would go to the Japanese bookstores that we had locally, and I would try to decipher. I kind of learned hiragana and katakana on my own just because I was so interested in video game magazines, and I think reading video game books, reading video game magazines, even when I couldn't play them, made me much more interested in it. Like there's a electronic games magazine and computer games magazine, and I would find these books like how to win at video games. And even though I wasn't playing them, right there in front of me, I would just be flipping through these and I'd be studying them. And little did I know that, that kind of literacy was not just helping me learn how to read, but it was also teaching me important things about the video game industry that would come in handy later. So living in Hawaii really, I think, helped in that it was this cultural bridge between Japan and the US, and so many of the innovations that were coming out in video games seemed to hit where I was sooner than other places. It was full of electronics and technology, and businessmen coming from Japan, and just kind of like this stuff was getting around, and I couldn't, it couldn't hide from me. I would just, there'd be like this one main shopping section near Waikiki, and it would have like all the latest stuff, all the Sony camcorders and VCRs and electronics, and the electronics section would be extremely robust and have all, the game systems and games out on display. And I was always exposed to it.
Did you have many arcades there?
Yes, absolutely. Hawaii was a very good place for video games. I remember when I was in grade school, my elementary school was across the street from one of the best arcades I've ever been to in my life. It was called Kaimuki Q, which is what you'd probably think would be this rundown, dilapidated place. It allowed smoking. Most of the people there were these really old dudes who would go into this back room, and I don't even know what they did back there. I think they did some kind of gambling or something back there, but it looked kind of seedy. But they had, all the latest arcade games, and as well as the imports from Japan that I mentioned, and just stuff that I didn't see anywhere else. So that was like an arcade that I would sneak up. I would sneak there before I'd go to school. I'd go there and I'd play games, and then I would go to school afterwards. And I remember the first time I saw, there were two games that really affected me that became my favorite, and that was Gradius and Life Force. I saw there like for the first time. And, when I first saw Life Force in it, it had all of that speech and the scroll speed was just so fast and exciting. I was just completely hooked. And those memories really stuck with me that I would see games there released on a weekly basis, daily, almost like a daily basis. That would excite me. And I just couldn't wait to see what was going to show up there next.
So I heard online that your parents weren't a fan of you playing so many video games, and they turn around and the story goes, I've heard they said, if you want to play video games, you've got to earn money from it. You've got to make a living from it. Is this true? And was that kind of like the catalyst to kind of get you going with your career?
Well, I wouldn't exactly say they said I had to make money with it. I think that was more from my side, that they just thought it was, okay, so they said literally it was a waste of time and money. And I'm rebellious. Like if somebody tells me I can't do something, I'm going to find a way to find a way to contradict that. And I guess, well, there's a TV show called Starcade. They would have teens and kids and adults, whatever, playing arcade games, and they'd win, cash and prizes on a game show. And they would play the latest arcade game. So I was, of course, already watching it because I was mesmerized by it. And I wanted to be on that show someday. But I lived in Hawaii, and and it was in the continental U.S. and I didn't live anywhere near there. But I figured I'd just play games, try to be good at them, and I guess eventually after that arcade era, the NES, the 8-bit era hit, and it became big. And they eventually had a contest that was in my area, held at the local department store called Holiday Mart. It's actually a branch of the big chain store Daiei in Japan. Like I said, there's this bridge between Japan and the US through Hawaii. So yeah, they had a big island-wide, it was statewide actually. I think they had stores on other islands, and they had a competition, and it was on Super Mario Brothers. If you got the furthest with the most score and coins, then you'd be the winner. And I guess they had a whole bunch of cool cash and prizes. So I was like, okay, maybe I'm good enough to do this. I think by the time that contest came around, I got to the point where I kind of knew I was good, just because I'd go to the arcade, I'd play games, and people would actually crowd around the machine and watch, because I'd get high scores and sort of things like that. And I kind of saw that dynamic. I saw, when I saw a good player, I knew what it looked like when they played, and I just kind of pushed myself to try to be as good as them, because I was always assuming that there was someone better than me. So I was always overcompensating to try to be better than this invisible thing they didn't know. So I entered that contest, and then I won. And not only did I win, but so the goal was to get as far as you can in the game. So it went by world and then by score. And that actually was a really good rule set. It's probably one of the best rule sets I've ever seen for a video game tournament, because it forced the player to kind of manage their risk reward. Like, do you go farther or do you go for points? But you want to go farthest. So I was the only one in the whole competition, during its 2 weeks that it was running. Like there's like a preliminaries and the finals. I was the only one that was able to beat the game. Oh, so wow. At that point, I was beating the game with the highest score possible. I think I was getting around 300k points, depending on how much risk I did, because you have to get the points along the way.
Yeah.
If you assume that everybody's going to beat the game, which I was, then you have to maximize that to secure the win. That's why I love that rule set. So I was the only one in the whole competition that was beating the game, and for me,
you probably thought, oh, I've got to get a high score because everybody else is beating the game as well.
Like, well, everybody else, how much are they getting? They're probably getting like 300, 500,000. I better, really push myself. So I got it down to the point where, I was basically speed running a game just like in the late 80s. So just having that dynamic, having that sort of challenge in front of me is just kind of interesting to look at it, seeing where things have gone since then. Once I won that, my parents' tune changed, and they were very supportive of me from that point forward. All I had to do was prove that it was possible, and prove that I was good enough and motivated enough to have this love for video games carry me through life, and it did.
I was wondering, like, how did you prepare yourself for it? Like, there was a lot of competitive gamers before that would do patterns in Pac-Man and stuff like that and learn the kind of routines. How did you get the knowledge to play these new titles?
Well, so the information back then was different. There wasn't an internet. I kind of just read books about games and kind of gleaned knowledge on how games worked. I knew there were bugs. I knew about, like the Pac-Man split screen. If you roll over 255, bad things happen. That seemed to be a pattern that I would read about in all of these 80s books. I would play a game and then I would learn from it, and I would just try to do better and better. I would write down how long something took me. Oh, I also had a Betamax VCR. Yes, Betamax from the 80s. That my parents, my parents are Asian. They had Betamax, so I would record my games and I would play them back. And in the mid 80s, I'm not sure how many people did that, but it was a valuable tool. And I just sort of learned as I went along. I found all sorts of crazy tricks and patterns on my own. Like I wouldn't read about these things. Like there's that trick with Mario where you stand at the edge of the stairs and you do a jump. And if there's a turtle shell there, you'll bounce on it and get a whole bunch of 1-ups. Like I found that in 1985. Like to go back a little bit further, I actually got one of those test market Nintendos from New York in 1985. My dad just happened to be there, and he got me one of those test market Nintendos. I had it before anybody else. Like no one in Hawaii had one of those, to my knowledge, when I got it. And I was just like, wow, this Super Mario Brothers is just, arcade perfect, or, it was better than anything I'd ever seen for a game system. It just blew me away. And I had it really early. I was playing it really early, and I loved the thing. And I was familiar with the controls because I had those little Game & Watches that Nintendo made back in the day. I'm like, I know this control. I know that plus shaped control thing. It was different from all the other consoles that came before, but to me, it was familiar, and it helped me learn the game. And I would find things in games. Like there's bugs that I found on games that to this day, like people don't talk about them. There's this weird one I found in Ghosts and Goblins. I think Ghosts and Goblins was the first hard game that I played that people would consider to be a challenge, but I blew through it. And I was like, I was just a kid, and I thought every game was that hard or was going to be that hard. So my standard for difficulty was set very high at a very young age. And there's I guess third-party games I felt were harder than the Nintendo ones. And yeah, I think Ghosts and Goblins was really a good training ground for what was to come. And my favorite games were the ones that ended up being harder. And people would think I was crazy. I'd be like, they would say like, man, I've played this game Golgo 13. It's so hard. There's no way you can beat it. And I'm like, dude, I beat that, no problem. I got to the point where the kids in school were starting to pay me to advance their game in Zelda and Zelda 2. I think Zelda 2 was the one I got the most kids paying me to advance their game with. And that started my journey as a competitive, or what do you call, professional game player, where I was actually getting money and kids were letting me have and borrow their games.
That is just going off topic there. That has just unlocked an early memory for me of doing that with Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation.
Oh, wow.
My friends were giving me their memory cards and asking me to get them further in the game, but I was just copying saves and putting it on their memory card. So I was doing the exact same thing, but it was probably a little bit easier for me. But that's amazing. So you did that competition. You were then, we read online that you were at the Nintendo World Championship in the early 90s. What's the story there? Did you go straight from that little competition, or did you kind of build up to it?
It started with that store chain in Hawaii competition. That was the first one that I did. It was like in 88 or 89. And the Nintendo World Championships was in 1990. And my family was moving to California from Hawaii. And I was really upset at that, to be honest, because I was just at that age where I was starting to get friends. And, I was getting kind of settled in, and I thought people were starting to like me, and the whole video game thing was really good. I was a state champion. This is like, I didn't want to leave the state that I had success in and go to California. But I guess my older brother was going to college, so kind of like a big thing the family was going through, and I didn't really have a choice in the matter. So after the move was made, I tried to make the best of things, and then I heard about through Nintendo Power that they were going to have this bigger contest. And of course, since I had experience, and by that time, since I had won that Hawaii championship, I kind of knew I had a chance. So that's kind of how I got into it. In my local area, which was California, they had one. Oakland was the city qualifier that was closest to me. I went there. It was like 3 days, and the first day I was feeling pretty good. I got pretty good scores, and by the end, everybody was watching me play because my scores were higher than everybody else. And by the time it got down to the top 7. I think I had like maybe the first or second best score in that city, and I didn't end up winning that city because the kid that did win had come from his city where he had lost, which was Portland. He beat me, but we became good friends afterwards. We have a lot of history. Robin Mahara ended up winning Oakland, but he had come from Portland where he had lost. Then after I came in third in Oakland, I went to the next closest city, which was Los Angeles, and I ended up winning there. So,
okay.
I followed the same path, and we ended up seeing each other again at Universal Studios, and we became really good friends ever since.
Oh, awesome. So how did you do? Did you then kind of go to, did that escalate to the World Championship then? Did it from there?
Yeah, that was the Universal Studios was like the grand finals.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be in Florida, but they changed it to cheap out, I guess, and they figured it'd be cheaper to send everybody back to Universal Studios Hollywood, where my preliminaries was. But I actually liked that I had won my city championship at Universal Studios because it was just like the movie The Wizard.
Yeah.
So I was actually, the winner of that. If you follow the path, I followed the path, and that's where it led me. And Thor Ackerland ended up winning the whole thing for our division there. He's also a really good friend of mine and ours, and he was head and shoulders above everybody else in terms of skill on Tetris, especially. But a great guy, and he innovated. He used the controller in ways that nobody else did, and even I look back at it now, I'm like, he definitely deserved to take the whole thing, and I learned from it, and that really served me going on forward. I might not have won that whole Nintendo championships, but I would learn from that and be able to win one of my own later on.
Yeah, well, that was goes nicely into our next question. So we're fast forwarding a couple of years here, so fill in the gaps if you need to. But you won the Sega Sonic and Knuckles Rock competition, which is legendary. Like that was actually, it was on TV and everything.
Yeah,
wasn't it?
that's right.
So then it was
the Nintendo one was supposed to be that big, but they didn't put it up on TV like they were supposed to, and it just wasn't quite the spectacle that I think it really deserved to be. But Sega was at that point in 1994 winning the war against Nintendo, which was in the concept in itself was crazy. It's just like Nintendo was so big at the time, who could even challenge them? And Sega was at the height of their popularity and success in 94, and they were able to have this big worldwide competition, like a real world championships where they flew in people from Japan and France and Brazil, and just make it this really huge thing, get it on MTV, broadcast it everywhere. That was something I really wanted to do. I was really into Sega. I mean, my exposure to Sega was that back when I won the Nintendo Championship in Hawaii, they asked me what my favorite game was, and I said Phantasy Star. And at that point, I had to explain to them what a Sega was, because everybody only knew Nintendo at the time. And I'm like, no, my favorite game is on this other machine called the Sega Master System, and it's called Phantasy Star. So it's just interesting that my very first esports endorsement was like for a game that wasn't even on the system that I won something for. And you can find that article, like there's scans of it where I talk about Phantasy Star when I won a Nintendo competition. And it's just kind of beautiful in a way that it ended up that way.
I've just got to ask, did you have the World Championship cart at all as well?
Yeah, at one point I did. And it was a prize that was given to us. I think at the time that I sold it, it probably went for the most that one had gone for. So I don't regret it, but there comes a point in time where when you have something, it just becomes a liability if you just keep holding on to it forever. Like it might get stolen, or your house might burn down or something. So I was just like, okay, it's time. I need to. I did, and I have a nice reproduction now, which is exactly I can play it whenever I want. But yeah, it was a really cool cartridge to have.
Awesome. You also kind of. That Sega competition, it was set up on Alcatraz, right? And,
they actually rented out the whole island. They put a whole bunch of money into its redevelopment and restoration. So Sega was like a really big deal in the Bay Area in California, and they were doing things like that. It was at that Alcatraz Island, and they had like the prison cells and things like that. They filmed our footage in, and it was kind of dirty. It was kind of bad. I thought that it was kind of unprofessional in retrospect, but they had to put on a show, and they on that end definitely they did a good job for that.
And did you see it as kind of a revival of like esports and that kind of gaming? Because I know before they'd had lots of historical stuff with Pac-Man and the older games, but did you see that as a kind of MTV and it being on video? Did it seem like something new?
It was just on a scale and on a level that had never been before. Like I had dreamed of being on Starcade. I mean, to me, that would have been just great, just to be on a TV game show with arcade games. Like that was my dream. But what they did with Rock the Rock just completely far surpassed anything that came before it. Having it be truly international for one thing, and then to have it be on TV. Nintendo was supposed to, but they didn't. But Sega was able to pull that off. So I had read about actually those old arcade game tournaments. I'd have these winning at video games books, and they would talk about the Twin Galaxies scoreboard, and they'd talk about all these these early 80s arcade competitions, and I would be like, well, how do I sign up? How do I participate in these? But of course, by that time, since print media was really slow, there's like no way you can participate in something that's already been covered. So you really kind of had to be in on it from the ground floor and know about it as it was coming up. So yeah, when the Sega thing happened, they talked about it, in their magazine. They talked about it, I think, locally through the radio. So they did a fairly decent job of promoting it. And when it came time, I was ready.
So this is where it gets a little bit, I kind of need to hear it from you to kind of figure out the history, I guess, the storyline. So, at this point, I've heard on the internet on certain videos, this is where you started kind of getting into the development side of games. But then also I've read that you started working at Tengen when you were just 14. So, I don't know, how old were you? Were you 14 at this time? Were you still really young?
13, 14.
You were 13, 14.
Yeah.
Wow.
See, what actually happened was I was, when I got sent down to Los Angeles, I wouldn't say sent, but by choice, after losing in Oakland, I had my mom drive me down to Los Angeles for the Nintendo World Championships to try to qualify there. After I'd won the city, I'd been hanging out with different people throughout the course of the weekend. I had made friends, and one of the friends that I made, his name is Mike Klug, definitely someone who's been, a good guidance for me my entire life. I was hanging out with him, and he was in the older age division. He was trying to qualify for that. And I was in the middle age division, the teens, and we're just hanging out. And I found out that he was from the same area that I was, and we both had driven down to LA from the Bay Area. So that's why we hung out. We were like, oh, well, you're from that area. Well, I'm from that area too. Okay, well, let's hang out. And little did I know, he was actually a gaming champion already. He was already had some record scores on pole position 2. That was like his game of choice. I didn't know that at the time. But at the end of the weekend, after I'd won, we were still hanging out, and he handed me his business card, and it said Tengen. I'm like, oh my God, I know Tengen. They made that version of Tetris that they can't sell anymore. And I knew the whole history behind that just from reading the game magazines and being so invested in the culture. So I was like, wow, that blew me away. And he said, yeah, you should come hang out with us at work and come check out the office and stuff like that. So I was still a week or two after my preliminaries, and I was already visiting the Tengen office, and I was so young that I wasn't old enough to get a work permit yet. So they paid me out of pocket.
Oh, wow.
Until I was old enough to get a work permit, which didn't take long, but it was, that to me just blew me away. And the funny thing is I'd already been working as a kid, because after I won the Hawaii championships, the local game store there, which most people might know as it was called Toys and Joys, which is like an online place. It's not around anymore, but in the 90s or in the 2000s, it was like this big gaming and kind of like pop culture retailer. I worked there right after I won the Hawaii championships, because Now, the child labor laws in Hawaii were super lax, so you could be like 10 years old and work at a store. So I was 10 years old working at a store, working at a game store. So that was a cool experience. So, working at a game company, though, was really the dream that I had, like after I got through, high school or whatever. That's what I was planning to do. But here I was already doing that way prior to that. And they were paying me out of pocket. I was doing odd jobs around the office, primarily stuff like testing and game counseling. I'd answer the phones, and I'd read about, game counselors in Nintendo Power. I always wanted to be one. So through that, I was kind of doing that job. I did things like write manuals. I wrote the manuals for Rampart and Gauntlet 4. And I did some actual design concepts for Gauntlet 4 that got into the game. It got all these new modes in it. And one of them was this RPG mode that I really felt the game should have, because I didn't think an arcade port of Gauntlet would fly in the mid 90s, since it was like an 86 arcade game. So I was like, okay, well, there's other games like Dungeon Explorer on the TurboGrafx. Like, you need to make a more robust quest. People want more RPG elements. The player should be able to level up and buy things and things like that. And in order to greenlight the game, in order to get it so that people would buy it in the US, I really felt these elements needed to happen. And the developer for that, like, I didn't know this at the time. To me, I thought that there's this Tengen Japan office, and Tengen Japan could do whatever they wanted. I didn't know that at the time there were these huge limitations, and everything had like a time and a budget, and it was highly unlikely that any of this stuff would get done. But M2, this was like their first project and their first chance to prove themselves. So those mad lads did it. Like, they actually went and put the RPG mode in the game. So that to me was like one of the things that I felt was a highlight of me working on games in those early days.
And they were a subdivision of Atari, weren't they? So,
yes. So the politics behind it, at one time, Atari Coin-Op and Atari Consumer, who made the computers and consoles, were the same company. But they, when Warner, I think, got involved, they split the two off. And the Atari that I worked for was Atari Games Corporation, who made the arcade games. So when they wanted to make home games for platforms like Nintendo, they kind of had to make another brand that wasn't Atari. So Tengen was that home brand that they were able to make their arcade games based off of and publish other things. It became really big, prolific publisher of like a lot of different stuff just besides their arcade games. Because at the time, I mean, now that I look at the business dynamic and you look at how publishers operate, back then, they're one of the very few companies that people would, want to send their stuff to maybe get on a system. I know we had, I know you guys over in Europe had Domark, and we had a partnership with them. So we published a lot of their stuff, and a lot of their stuff would come through my hands, and would do evaluations and reports on.
I was going to ask about that. Like, did you then have much exposure to the kind of European gaming scene? And
yes, I did.
What did you think about it?
I was actually very interested in it. So for one thing, I have found out that in certain parts of Europe, the Master System won, and then NES was the system that actually got left behind in a lot of cases. So we would get things. You would have stuff like Super Space Invaders and Paperboy 2 on the Master System come in through our office, and I'd have to play them, and some of them were really terrible. But I'd see that stuff, and I'm like, wait, they're still making stuff for the Master System over there. That how interesting is that? So yeah, I was kind of interested in, and a lot of the people in the company, in the department that I worked in sort of like the consumer product development division. We had a lot of people who loved just quirky, obscure stuff. We all loved imports, but I think the thing that struck out to me was there was like the Amiga, and apparently the Amiga in Europe was like the dominant platform, and they had to me, it was alien to me, but they had console quality games on a computer, because over on our side of the ocean, we had like MS-DOS PCs, and the games on it were like 4 colors. Like, the games did not look good and they did not play good. But here I'd go over to my friend's house, and he'd have an Amiga with all these cracked games, and I was playing like some Euro-made version of Afterburner that looked fairly like the arcade version. And they'd show me things like I think Turrican was like, it's like, to me, it kind of looked like Metroid. I'm like, whoa, this looks really cool. It's really colorful. It's got all these kind of like a different feel. There are a lot of different stuff like Shadow of the Beast. They were showing off to me things that were popular in Europe that I hadn't been exposed to, since they hadn't been released on console in our region. So I had an exposure to the European stuff. They actually had a special setup for the PAL stuff since it ran on, most people know is, different electric systems and different video standards. So there would be like a special setup for that stuff. And it's like the stuff would run slower and it would look really bad under fluorescent lights. So yeah, I knew about all that stuff. And, kind of like being in the industry, you're forced to be exposed to it. And it was very fascinating to me.
Now, I've got to ask, it could be going off topic here. We're in 1995-ish at the moment. What's the story, your side of things, for Primal Rage 2? Because obviously this game has gone down in history as essentially a lost game by Midway. And obviously it has popped up a couple of times in arcades. I think there's a couple floating out there. But you mentioned to us pre-show that you had a little bit of a hand in that. What's the story there?
Yeah, I was actually the game designer on that project. I worked on Primal Rage 1. And it's sort of on Primal Rage 1, I was in the transition. I was like kind of going back and forth between the arcade division and the home division. I still worked for Tengen. I was working on things like Gauntlet 4 and still doing kind of like my product development consultant, basically was my title. So I do a little bit of everything, and they still wanted me working over there. So I had split my day between what I did in consumer, and then I'd go over to the arcade side. Actually, the first arcade game I worked at Atari was another fighting game that got canceled called Cyberstorm. And that one was like a fighting game with robots. It wasn't very good. And one thing, so when Street Fighter 2 took off, like everybody wanted to make a fighting game. Everybody who made arcade games would make their own Street Fighter ripoff. But it was hard to do. And people at Atari, people at other companies didn't know what made a good fighting game. They didn't know how they worked. They didn't know what a combo was. But I knew all that stuff since I was just so invested in the games. And I was already winning. I was actually in the very first Street Fighter 2 tournament ever held, endorsed by Capcom. Capcom actually tested their games at my local arcade, which is Sunnyvale Golfland, legendary arcade. That was like, where the very first like Evo Ancestor was held, was at Sunnyvale Golfland. That was my local arcade. They got everything, test units and things like that. Atari tested there, Capcom tested there. And then there was a secret 7-Eleven, it's like a convenience store that they also did, Capcom did their test games at, and that's actually where I played Street Fighter 2, and I got really good at the game. So I'd go to Golfland, and I'd just like destroy everyone on Golfland. I'd be like, how's this guy get so good? And I'd just be like, well, I play at 7-Eleven actually. But so anyway, that's the background to me being like sort of like a fighting game expert as well. I won third place at the very first Street Fighter 2 tournament ever held at Sunnyvale Golfland. There's like this really cool trophy I got from it too. I think it's still the coolest trophy I have. It's of this, they just got a karate trophy and it puts Street Fighter 2 championship on it. I was just like, that's awesome. They didn't have any merchandise of Ryu at the time. Nobody knew who those characters were, but they got a karate dude on it, and that's all that matters. So I got to become an advisor for these fighting games at Atari, first starting with Cyberstorm, and there was another project that started a little bit later called T-Rex. And it was a little bit different from what you might know as Primal Rage. Like the characters weren't as colorful. But the programmer on it, showed me the game, and I guess we would play fighting games. Like we had like a game room that had different games in it. And since he was working on T-Rex and I was working on Cyberstorm, we'd go back there and I'd kick his ass, and then he'd get mad at me and call me cheap and all that. But he said, "Oh, you should check out our game." And eventually, after Cyberstorm folded, then they just kind of absorbed me onto there, and I was still kind of like running between consumer and arcade, but eventually I went full time. And then on Primal Rage 1, I was the one who was like programming like the AI set for the characters and doing hitboxes and collisions and tuning the gameplay and making sure the game played well, combos, things like that were all fun. Unfortunately, a lot of the disagreements I had with the team, like I didn't like the special move input system, but for some reason,
I was literally about to say, is it because you were so good at fighting games? That's why you made the combo so hard?
No, I knew that they are hard, but I could do the biggest combo in the game, like no problem. But I also recognize that, people coming up to the game, playing it for the first time, need to be able to like do special moves. And the way that they implemented them, where you hold down buttons and then have to wiggle the joystick, it was not conducive to the standards of the time. people who play Street Fighter are going to try to do things a certain way just because that's how games were evolving. That was the standard at the time. And they didn't get that you needed to have things follow a certain standard. They felt that being unique was more important at the time. You know, they kept insisting that the special moves be that way. And I was just like, oh man, that's actually going to affect the success of the game going forward. And it did. And it wasn't until the game went on test in Japan and it completely bombed that they, nobody could find special moves. So that they made a version of the game that allowed for standard special move inputs. And thankfully, that's what they went with for Primal Rage 2 as well.
So from Primal Rage 1 to Primal Rage 2, what kind of happened there?
So yeah, there's a lot that went into it. But originally, we were going to make an update to Primal Rage 1 that was supposed to include a boss character. And maybe have some more balancing changes and things like that. But as the industry was moving forward and games like Killer Instinct were starting to come out, it looked like, okay, well, instead of putting all that effort into just an update, why not put that boss into a full-fledged sequel? Because at that time, Primal Rage was like the best-selling arcade game of '94. And we had merchandising, we had like a toy line and all this stuff for it. All these different home versions were planned, a dozen conversions on, like, I don't think we ever had a game through Tengen / Time Warner that had that many SKUs. I think still to this day, Primal Rage is probably the most ported of the, I guess, contemporary, not like a classic game like Paperboy, but like something that we brought out during its time that was released at like a year after.
It was on like every 16-bit and every 32-bit, and then I think was it on the Game Boy as well? It was on everything.
Unfortunately, it was on the Game Boy and the Game Gear.
Yeah,
it was on the Tiger R Zone, and I don't think any other Atari game can even lay claim to that honor. So, gonna make an update, and we decided to go for a full-fledged sequel. But there's a lot of politics involved. Like, they wanted to throw us onto the Kojak hardware, which is like a coin-op Jaguar hardware, because it was like free or something. So they were trying to put us on this really bad hardware. And the Jaguar was actually worse than the Primal Rage 1 arcade hardware. And when we tried porting to it, and it was just so bad. It was like, we couldn't even make it look as good as part 1. So we were just like, no, we cannot be on this. And it was really demoralizing to the team to have to like put, a game that was considered to be good on this really bad hardware. But eventually, other hardwares became a thing. I think we tested the Titan for a while. So we thought we were going to go to Titan, but then everybody said, oh man, that thing is so terrible to develop for. I remember, so I was still going back and forth between consumer and arcade. And I remember the programmer, our lead programmer back on Saturn Virtua Racing, at the start of the project, he was happy. And at the end, he looked like a zombie. He was just like, it took everything out of the guy. I'm just like, man, dude, what happened to you? It's funny because my contribution to that Virtua Racing game was, I think I provided the soundtrack because I collected game soundtracks and I had all the CDs, and they didn't have the Virtua Racing soundtrack, but I did. So I just let them borrow it, and they just ripped it and they put it on the Tengen Time Warner version. I'm just like, oh, cool. Having that Virtua Racing and Outrunners soundtracks really did some good. But yeah, that's just a side note. So yeah, Saturn was not a good platform to go to, but eventually the arcade PSX hardware became an option, and it was able to do a lot of the different things that we needed to do. We knew we needed to have a lot of animation frames. So our hardware wizards like built a hard drive interface that would allow it to, I mean, we didn't even have the term for streaming back then, but we were streaming animation frames off of the hard drive, or streaming the backgrounds of the music. And we were doing all sorts of technological things with Primal Rage 2 that no other game was doing. It was so far ahead of its time, and maybe that was a bad thing because you couldn't make a home port of something that was that advanced. So in one way, we were like actually bringing an experience that no one else could replicate. Like not even Killer Instinct would have the amount of frames of animation that we could have, since we had the tech to stream off the hard drive, and we had the production facilities to make all these stop motion animations that were really elaborate. But that also extended our production time to like an insane length. And it took like 7-9 months, I think, for me to get frames from an animated puppet onto the game program itself, because The graphics all had to be processed and cleaned up, and that was just a huge process in itself. So our ship date and the fact that we couldn't have a vertical slice demonstratable for our product really hurt the project and hurt its chances for release. And I think the worst thing was that Midway ended up buying Atari games from Time Warner, and since they own Mortal Kombat, it was redundant with their own product line. And after they had reductions in force and layoffs and other bad stuff happened to the company, it just created a very negative energy that led to the game's cancellation.
It's such a sad story, really, in the grand schemes of things, but it's interesting that, they did actually get a couple made and they kind of ended up out in the wild. I'm assuming they were test units or...
Yeah, they were test units. Yeah. I think our game was canceled even before, like the version out in the wild was supposed to be see how this game does and then make the choice based on that. But I think I remember when I was doing a presentation for GDC, I actually went into the emails and I looked at the dates and stuff like that. And I think we were canceled before that version even got out into the wild. So It's really sad because I don't think we had a chance, no matter how well we did, no matter how poorly or well or excited people would be to play that game. There's nothing that we could do. And I never would know I didn't think that I would ever know what it would be like to see people play that version of the game and be excited for it. But I ended up actually being able to get to see that because when the Galloping Ghost Arcade got the machine, they went and streamed the first days that they had of it on Twitch, like 24/7. They would just have like a pro gamer on that thing trying to find out all the moves and the fatalities and things like that. In the year 2014, which is like 17 years, almost 20 years later, discovering all the secrets in that game that they could for the first time. And I got to see that live thanks to, the technology of the time. And, most games that are out there had an FAQ, they had move lists, they had YouTube videos and playthroughs, but Primal Rage 2 didn't because it hadn't been emulated. It was too quirky, the hardware was too weird, all the hard drive stuff. And I guess it had some protection to the code that our programmers like Ming told me about it later that, I had written some traps and things like that into the code so people couldn't reverse engineer it. And I'm like, well, that made it so people couldn't emulate it. And that's why it was a lost game for so long, because people just couldn't play it in that era of emulation where, even if something was canceled, if there were games out in the wild, you'd see emulation of it, but not for Primal Rage 2, not until 2017, which was after the Galloping Ghost Arcade had it. So it's fairly recent. And, it made these big news headlines in 2017. And that to me, was really vindicating to see people enjoy the game on a level that it really deserved to be.
Yeah, 100%. It was, I guess, it's a sad story, but a nice end that the fan base, managed to get a hold of it and, first of all, stream it like that in 2014 and then take it apart and get the emulation out of it in 2017. So it was a nice end to the story.
Yeah. Also, while I was developing it and when it was going out on test, I thought people hated it. I thought it was, maybe we didn't do well enough. But after seeing people talk about it, getting to play it, and plus seeing people discuss it using modern fighting game terms, and then them saying that, it's solid, it's good. Why isn't this a fan game at EVO and things like that? I'm like, wow, that, no better honor. I think Engadget said it was like 2017's hottest new fighting game. And I was just like blown away by the love that the game was getting after so many years.
That's awesome. Really good to see. And it's on MAME at the moment, isn't it?
They have a special version, MAME for Rage 2, developed by Gruntzilla 94 is the version. And I think there are people in the community who are actually doing ROM patches to fix some of the things. Like I think Talon Slide was one of the things that I said, it wasn't like that when we left the lab, but the lab version hasn't been found yet. So on a computer, on a hard drive, on some discs out there is a more finished version of the game that's even out there now. Because I remember I was working on the game for a couple of months after that version was made until they mothballed it. And I wanted to make sure my last fixes got it into the game. So hopefully that version will be found someday.
Well, another amazing title that you worked on was Marvel vs. Capcom. And I used to go into the arcades and just the selection of characters on there and the animation was absolutely awesome. What was it like working on that project?
Yeah, Marvel vs. Capcom was basically the I guess the de facto successor. X-Men versus Street Fighter is what it started with. But then Marvel vs. Capcom was the chance for us to, see characters like Mega Man and Captain Commando and Strider Hiryu to really get their time in the spotlight. And I would say it was the most exciting thing for me, especially I think Strider was one of my favorite game characters of all time. And I didn't get to, so, at Atari, I did, things like, the hitboxes and the timings and things on a very detailed level of the game I was involved in. But for Capcom, I did things more on a sort of a system level. So I would design a special move system, or I would design something like the in Street Fighter 3, how you do taunts and different things happen. I would come up with things like that, or the EX moves system where you push 2 buttons and you have more invincibility frames and things like that. So I would come up with things like that. I'd come up with titles for the games. I came up with Tech Romancer and a few others. It wasn't as, I really kind of wanted to get in there and do hitboxes and timings and things like that again. But Marvel vs. Capcom, I think the most fun thing I did was I got to do all the writing for the characters. So Strider Hiryu in particular, I went back into the NES game and I played through it. I recorded it. I saw every single line in the game, and I made sure that he was written like the character that everybody envisioned him to be. So that was really fun. I think in the years that were to follow, someone would make a Strider. They were a really big fan of Strider, and they made this web page, and they said these are the words that I live by, and it was basically everything I wrote for Strider. And it was just wow, that was no better honor but to have people live by the words that you wrote. And that was a lot of fun for Marvel vs. Capcom. And that's MVC 1 is probably, between that and Turbo Hyper Fighting, are my 2 favorite fighting games of all time.
Yeah, I think for me, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 probably edges it out. I just think the roster on that is incredible. But did you expect Marvel vs. Capcom 1 to just become so big and become such a classic? Because here in the UK, me and Ravi were joking about it before, that the older boys would go play Marvel vs. Capcom at our local arcade.
All the cool guys.
All the cool guys would go play it. That was the cool game to go play at our local arcade. It was such a big game. Well,
it's got a different vibe than Street Fighter. Street Fighter is single hits, big damage. But Marvel vs. Capcom, X vs. Street Fighter, that whole series, it's get massive, numbers racking up on your combo, do these big combos, air juggles, and it was really flashy. So
yeah,
when you watch the game, even if you don't know anything about fighting games, it's just so dynamic to watch everything happen. And I think it was a natural progression from a fighting game. But I think both styles of games have their place.
I think it's nice to, for me, Marvel vs. Capcom, it's such a good game to pick up and just, like you say, looks fantastical. And even if you're not very good at fighting games, you're smashing out these big 50-hit combos from just button bashing and hitting them all together. Whereas if, Street Fighter 2, like you say, there's a place for that as well, where you can do, a lot more damage with just a couple of punches and kicks. But that leads nicely on to, you also worked on Street Fighter Third Strike. Was that a big deal for you? Was it kind of scary finally following up on one of the biggest games of all time, with the Street Fighter 2 series? How did it feel?
So I was, a really big fan of Capcom. Even when I was working on Primal Rage, it was just the reason I got that job was because I was really big into Street Fighter 2. I was a tournament winning player at the time, and I was just so invested in it. And Capcom to me was my dream. I just wanted to be involved in that. I wanted to work there someday, even though I felt I'd probably be stuck at Atari forever because, the stuff that they made for Capcom that was popular, it was all made in Japan. So it's just what hope did I have? The US office just brought stuff out over here kind of as a publisher, but the actual development was done in Japan. But when I actually ended up being involved in Capcom, I worked for Capcom Japan. I reported to Yoshiki Okamoto and Tom Shiraiwa, and we worked, reporting to the Osaka office, which is really, it was an interesting relationship because it wasn't reporting to the Capcom Sunnyvale office. I pretty much just kind of went there for administrative things. But day to day, the stuff that I worked on got put into the games that were being developed in Japan. And that to me was huge. And I think the first games that I think I did things on were Pocket Fighter was the first thing I had stuff in. Like, we had to come up with like these quiz questions and answers, and I was able to put some like fighting game references in there and things like that. So that was pretty cool. But yeah, Street Fighter was like the big one, and I remember even prior, I think like one of the first things that I was privy to is I got to see the character designs for Street Fighter 3 before anyone had seen them, and I was like, I don't know, man, Oro, Necro, I'm not liking these guys. These guys look like freaks. I don't know if this is going to be popular. So I was excited to work on Street Fighter, but I didn't have faith in the character designs as they were coming across from Japan. And sure enough, when Street Fighter 3 hit, it was not the instant success that Street Fighter 2 was. It didn't
was
have
a sleeper, really, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So I know eventually, it did catch on, but it wasn't until those games were actually out of production and no one was making fighting games anymore that Street Fighter 3 Third Strike got really popular. But at the time I was working on them, I did the best I could. I think some of my best writing is in Street Fighter 3 in that series. And I came up with some systems like the EX special moves and things like that. I thought were pretty good. But to me as a player, kind of the speed and the dynamic that I enjoyed in games like Turbo Hyper Fighting, it was different in Street Fighter 3. Like, there's more of a focus on parrying, and I was good at the game. I enjoyed it, and I was competitive at it, but I just liked Street Fighter 2 better. I liked Marvel vs. Capcom better, and there's a certain appreciation you can get for Street Fighter 3, but that level of depth where you can get to appreciate it, you really have to be surrounded by other good players to appreciate that depth of competition. I think even for its time and even up till now, like, it's something that you have to be a little bit too invested in it to appreciate it. So I think, like, I respect Street Fighter 3 for the design and for what it is, but it's just over that line of like where it could have been, wildly successful had it gone down a different path. And I think a lot of it started from the characters just not being marketable, not having as appealing characters as at the time. Like, SNK was having these characters, be really just kind of cool looking. Like, they'd be wearing these fashionable outfits, and when cosplay started becoming a thing, everybody was doing the SNK characters. But the Capcom characters were, these freaks. It's like, you don't go to a convention and see someone cosplaying as, Oro or 12 or any of these like
any of these mad characters. Yeah.
So,
no, I know.
Limited its popularity. So I might not, have said this too much in previous interviews, but you're hearing it first. I actually I was excited to work on Street Fighter as a brand, but in terms of what Street Fighter 3 was, I knew it had a lot going against it, and we did the best we could. Luckily, I was also working on Alpha 3 at the same time, and Alpha 3 was just fine. So it had the characters and things that people still came to expect for the most part. I still like Alpha 2 better, but that's just me.
And how did you, just to backpedal a little bit, how did you kind of get involved in Capcom? Because you said, Capcom was like, you were worried you were going to be stuck at Atari, and it's like Capcom is, especially in the 90s, they were the fighting guys. They were the fighting games guys. They were the go-to fighters. How did that come about? How did you, get the job there?
Okay, so there's, in the 90s, late 90s, there was kind of like these fighting game, or these like competitive gamer / magazine writer / I work at a game company types. And we'd do all three. And we kind of like, each discipline would kind of be blissfully unaware, but aware that we had these skills. So you had people who would, write at GamePro, who would work at Capcom and then enter contests. And then I'd be the guy that I'd work at Atari, and there are a few magazines that I would contribute to, and win the big Sega tournament. And we would show up to places like CES and E3, and we'd all hang out and things like that. And you would make friends. And one of my biggest friends, Eric Suzuki, ended up, I got him a job at Tengen working on some fighting game that got, obviously got canceled. And then he ended up going to Capcom and being sort of like one of the main guys to help bring the Japanese games out into the US. And we worked together at, we're not really together on the same project, but we're in the same building at Atari Tengen. He went over to Capcom. And then when Primal Rage 2 got canceled, it just seemed like the natural thing. It's just like, well, Primal Rage 2 is not coming out. What do I do? I think I'm going to go work on Street Fighter 3. So that really helped me kind of put that experience of having a game console behind me, because I knew I was going to be working on, really polished, really good games from that point forward, working at Capcom. So I had that kind of lined up, on the last days I knew I was leaving Atari. I knew what was coming. I was just like, all right, I get to work on some really cool stuff now. And I was super excited about it, especially knowing that I'd be reporting to Capcom Japan was really huge, because I didn't think that was possible. And ironically, so our department at Capcom, we were actually replacing, there were a couple other guys that I was alluding to in this sort of circle of would show up at CES and E3, and we'd go to the arcade afterwards, and we'd all beat each other up at the arcade afterwards. So James Goddard and Dave Winstead were at Capcom doing that job, and they had been the sort of like consultants on Street Fighter 2 series. They actually went over to Atari to work on another fighting game that got canceled for several years called 10th Degree. While Eric and I went over to Capcom, and we started doing what they used to do. So, in terms of being, design support and localization and contributing to a lot of the Capcom games from the Western perspective that got implemented into the Japanese product.
Actually working on a new title at the moment, aren't you? Strike Blazinger. Could you tell us more about that?
Oh, absolutely. So, after being in the industry so long, eventually you just want to make the games that you just want to make. Like, especially if you have indie capabilities now with great engines like Unity and Unreal and the tools being available. One thing, so we just finished talking about Capcom, but while we were there, something really struck out at me when, Eric and I would talk to legendary people like Yoshiki Okamoto. They'd say, like, why are you working at Capcom? You should be out there making your own games, making your own mark out there. And they would actually bring this question to us. And at the time, we were young and we loved Capcom, and that was our dream. We wanted to work on Street Fighter, we wanted to work on Capcom games. But eventually you come to a point where you just want to make something that excites you. And Strike Blazinger is kind of like the culmination of that. So the guy that got me into Capcom, Eric, he's our producer, and another friend who was ex-Atari and myself were the leads on this thing. And, we're trying to make the games that we really want to have come into reality. And we're really big fans of Sega. And I love games like Space Harrier and Phantasy Star. So when the elevator pitch is like, it's kind of like a spiritual successor to Space Harrier and Phantasy Star and all these kind of like cool techie sci-fi things that Sega just kind of doesn't make anymore, with the bright colors and sort of new futurism that was popular in the mid 80s. And we made a prototype and we took it to various conventions, and it became a really big sensation. Everybody that played it really loved it. And then we started to realize, the reason why it's not out yet is because we realized we had to make the game a lot better than we originally thought we had to, because the potential, it was so good and so fun. It's just like, we can't bang this out in a year like we thought we would. We're going to need more resources. We're going to need, realize the dream of hundreds of levels. And, when we, I guess our producer said, put 2-player implementation into the game. And it's just like, when you take a single player game and you turn it into a 2-player game, you start to have to do things like, tabulation for collisions and score, and everything in the game is now applied to 2 players instead of 1. So it's really complicated. But anyway, I digress. So the project became a bigger thing than we thought it would be. So then now we started to have to sort of restructure our studio and our games so that we could ship multiple games, smaller projects, leading up to the bigger release.
That's amazing. And unfortunately, we are the Retro Hour, and we're coming up to about an hour and 10, 20 minutes now.
Joe's like, I wanted to do 2 hours.
Honestly, Ravi was like, we're going to have to wrap it up. But this has been absolutely amazing, Chris. And I'm going to ask you now, will you be able to come on again in the future and talk all about esports and Tetris with us because of...
Oh my gosh, right. I didn't even get to do a Tetris for Ravi yet.
I know. And I'm just like... We've got like 20 years of esports to still talk about, but we've ended up covering, I think, a lot of your competitive
the
stories.
competitive and the
and a lot
game
of the game
just
development
touching
stuff.
on it.
So I would be absolutely honoured and love if you could come back and talk to us about your esports career.
Yeah,
and
it sounds good. I'll be looking forward to it, and it's just I'm honored that there's enough stuff to talk about to fill not just your podcast, but perhaps many more going on into the future.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You know, sometimes we worry people go, oh, it's because they've run out of guests. They've revisited somebody a year later or 6 months later, but it is not the case whatsoever. It is,
You're going to have to change the name of your podcast to the Retro Hours.
Yeah, the Retro Hours at this rate. But this has been absolutely amazing, Chris. Absolutely loved it. Would be an absolute honour to have you come back on and, you know, say Tetris for Joe, Tetris for Ravi.
Boom Tetris for Joe. Boom Tetris for Ravi. Yeah, let's do that next time.
Absolutely
awesome.
Love it.
Thanks so much, Chris.
It's been a joy and an honor, and looking forward to it. And see you all next time.